in the texts of it is inscribed in the texts of all ancient traditions. In China, Confucian-based texts said, men go out, women stay in, which of course highlights the political and public role of men in contrast to the private and domestic role of women. And of course, the practice of foot binding in China made it pretty certain that the women would stay inside. Furthermore, among the Greeks, can we eliminate that little thing up there? There you go. There you go.
Yay.
Okay. The famous Aristotle of Greek fame said a woman is, as it were, an infertile male. She is female, in fact, on account of her inadequacy. The New Testament said that wives should submit to their husbands in everything. And the Quran said, men have authority over women because Allah has made one superior to the other. So, patriarchy has been so pervasive in civilizations for the past 5,000 years that historians hardly noticed it. It was invisible because it was so pervasive and so assumed as the natural way things worked. But it is useful to remember at the outset that patriarchy was not eternal. Human beings have been wandering around this planet, Homo sapiens, for about 200 or 250,000 years. And the kind of patriarchy that we are discussing is the product of civilizations which are only 5,000 years, which means that for most of the experience of humankind on the planet, patriarchy was not what we have known it to be. In most hunting and gathering societies and early agricultural societies, this kind of pervasive patriarchy was largely absent. There was a lot of relative gender equality, although with separate roles for men and women. So the kind of patriarchy that we are discussing, although it has been pervasive for 5,000 years, is, in this larger perspective, a relatively recent development in human affairs. This simply illustrates the roles that women often played in hunting and gathering societies. We usually think of women as the gatherers, men as the hunters, but recent research has begun to turn up evidence that women were hunters as well as gatherers. So we are going to stick to the civilizations, which is where patriarchy emerged. Although patriarchy was pervasive across all civilizations, there were variations in the nature of that patriarchy. For example, in Egyptian civilization, women had greater opportunities than they did in the neighboring Mesopotamian civilizations. Women could own property, initiate divorce, walk the streets without a veil, none of which was true in Mesopotamia. Another example of the variations comes from ancient Greece. It turns out that democratic Athens was far more restrictive on their women than militaristic Sparta. In Sparta, women could take place in public sporting events, sometimes performing in the nude, actually. They were not secluded or segregated as they were in Athens. They married men of their own age, whereas Athenian women generally married much older men, and they had greater rights of inheritance. In fact, this was so pronounced that Aristotle complained that in Sparta, men are ruled by women. He was not amused. Now, it is also true that in many of these ancient civilizations, men were culturally encouraged to be kind to their women, as long as they stayed within the bounds of patriarchy. And of course, as you know, a few women rose to prominence despite the patriarchy of their societies. Hatshepsut in Egypt. There was one empress in China, Empress Wu. There was Aspasia. She was a prominent member of the Athenian intellectual elite and was a partner for Pericles. Two royal women in Vietnam led a several-year rebellion against Chinese control of patriarchy, against the Chinese control of Vietnam, excuse me. Not only were there variations, but there were occasional examples of pushback against patriarchy. In 195 BC, there was a big protest in Rome by Roman women against older wartime laws that had limited what they were allowed to wear and how much jewelry they could display. This protest was successful. Those laws were eliminated, and women, Roman women could adorn themselves as they pleased. There is another interesting example of patriarchal pushback by a number of Buddhist nuns from India in very early times. In fact, these nuns created a series of texts that became a part of the Hindu canon. The Buddhist canon. And in fact, it is the only scripture in the world that has been authored by women and to have achieved the status of scripture in those countries. So here is one of these so-called Psalms of the Sisters, in which she is expressing herself. O woman well set free, how free I am, how thoroughly free from kitchen drudgery, me stained and squalid among my cooking pots, my brutal husband ranked even less than the sunshades he sits and weaves always. Purged now of all my former lust and hate, I dwell, musing at ease beneath the shade of spreading boughs. Oh, but 'tis well with me. So here she had a chance to express herself about her squalid cooking pots and her brutal husband, and there are a number of other poems like this in these collections. But despite occasional pushbacks such as this, there was in ancient times no widespread critique of patriarchy, no major protest movement. And this is precisely what makes modern patriarchy so unique, because in the modern era, there has been a sustained critique of patriarchy. There has been a major social movement of pushback, and the name that we give to that, of course, is feminism. So what makes patriarchy unique in the last, 150 years or so, is that it has been frontally challenged in a way that it never has been before. It is one of the distinctive features of modern life. Now, feminism grew out of the European Enlightenment and the French Revolution. These movements in Europe in the late 18th century gave rise to the idea that many ancient traditions could be challenged, including the inferiority of women. For example, the French philosophical writer named Condorcet wrote this. He called for the complete destruction of those prejudices that have established an inequality of rights between the sexes. Now, not all of his fellow philosophers during the European Enlightenment agreed with him, but the question had been raised. Furthermore, during the French Revolution, in which women participated, the French Revolution raised the possibility of actually recreating human societies on a new foundation. And many women participated in the events of the French Revolution, such as this picture, which it's a famous picture showing women from Paris going out to the Versailles Palace to haul Louis and his wife back into Paris and to imprison them. A few of the women that participated in the French Revolution insisted, although unsuccessfully, that the ideals of liberty and equality should apply to women as well as to men. And so by the early 19th century, a small number of women, both European and American, had begun to develop what we now think of as a feminist consciousness. This consciousness became a mass movement during the second half of the 19th century. And as it did, it was a transatlantic movement. Both American and European women on both sides of the Atlantic attended the same conferences. They read each other's works. They corresponded frequently with one another. And what they wanted, at least initially, was primarily access to schools, to universities, to literacy, and to the professions where they could make a living for themselves. The more radical among them refused to take their husband's name. Some of them wore trousers under their skirts. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about this. The whole business began in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848 with this women's rights convention. I might add that when Suzanne and I got married about 30 years ago and we were on our way to our honeymoon, our first stop was Seneca Falls. She thought it useful to remind me as we began our married life. Elizabeth Cady Stanton developed what she called a woman's Bible. She took the original Bible and she simply took out the parts of it that she found offensive. And in general, she believed, as this is a quote from her, that the Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. By the 1870s, the main focus of the feminist movement was the vote. And growing numbers of ordinary middle-class women and working-class women began to join their more highly educated sisters in turning feminism into a mass movement. By 1914, some 100,000 women joined French suffragist movements. The North American Women's Suffrage Association claimed 2 million members. This is one of the parades that they staged in 1915. So by the beginning of the 20th century, in the world's most highly industrialized countries, the women's movement had become a mass movement. That was something new in world history. This movement had some successes. Upper and middle class women were now able to enter universities. Their literacy rates went up. In some US states, they could own and control their own property. Divorce laws were liberalized. There were new professions open to women: medicine, teaching, nursing, social work. Their progress on the issue of voting was slower. The first country in the world to adopt universal suffrage for women was New Zealand in 1893. New Zealand led the way. The Finns came a little bit later in 1906. Finland granted women the right to vote. Everywhere else, it was only after the First World War. The United States did this in 1920. And interestingly enough, France, where a lot of this thinking began, did not give women the right to vote until after the Second World War in 1945. Long after Turkey a Muslim country, had already done so. So, interesting. Now, all of this generated unprecedented discussion, public discussion, about the role of women in modern life. Henry Ibsen's play, A Doll's House, provoked an outrage when he portrayed a married woman leaving her husband and her children with a famous slam of the door. The door slam heard around the world, many people called it. Furthermore, there was all sorts of discussion by writers, by doctors, by journalists about a range of previously taboo subjects, including birth control and abortion and homosexuality. Socialists, too. In Europe, there weren't very many socialists in America, but in Europe, the socialist movement was divided on the women's issue. Some people argued that the women's movement was bringing new energy to the working class, and others believed that the women's movement simply served to divide the working class. And it took them a long time to work that out. Now, obviously, all of this provoked a considerable amount of backlash. Some academics and medical experts argued that the strain of education and of working in the world would cause serious reproductive damage and lead to the declining population of the country. So feminists were presented as selfish, willing to sacrifice their families and their country for the sake of their individual goals. Some people began to see the suffragists as, quote, a foreign body in our national life. So never before in any society had there been such a passionate and public debate about the position of women. It was really a novel feature of Western history in the 19th century. Now, turning to the 20th century. After the First World War and the achievement of suffrage, the feminist movement in the West sort of plateaued. And the new focus of feminist thinking and action took place in the communist countries. So in the first half of the 20th century, it was the communist countries, Russia and China, that took the most dramatic action in terms of women's rights. Now, in both of these countries, China and Russia, after their revolutions had succeeded, what occurred was a kind of state-directed feminism, which was very different from the feminism of the West, in which it sort of bubbled up from below. But in the communist countries, it came from the top down. For example, in Russia, within a few years of the Bolsheviks taking control of Russia, the Soviet Union had granted full legal and political equality to women. Marriage was proclaimed to be a civil procedure, not a religious procedure. And it could only occur, of course, among consenting adults. Divorce was legalized and made easier. There is a story that the Russians had what they called, or the Soviets had what they called a postcard divorce. You were tired of your wife, you sent her a postcard saying, "That's it, honey," and you were done. Women did not any longer have to take their husbands' surnames. Illegitimacy was abolished. Pregnancy leave was required, and women were actively recruited for industrial work and agricultural work, for that matter. During the 1920s, the Communist Party created a special branch called the Women's Department, Zhenotdel in Russian. The Women's Department organized all kinds of conferences for women. They trained women to run schools, daycare centers, medical clinics. They published newspapers and magazines saying that women can do anything. They provided literacy and prenatal classes. And in the Muslim parts of the Soviet Union, they actually encouraged women to take off their veils. Now, this is one example of a poster celebrating women agricultural workers. Oh, wait, no, that's coming. There was a lot of opposition to this especially among rural women who saw that their lives were being upended. And Stalin in 1930 abolished this women's department, claiming that women had already achieved equality and there was no more need for this special attention to that issue. But while it lasted, and it lasted pretty much throughout the 1920s, this was a remarkable experiment in state-directed feminism. It was animated by a sense of the limitless possibilities that now existed, now that the revolution had taken place. It didn't last, but it did. It is an interesting experiment in this kind of state-directed feminism. Something similar occurred in China after the Chinese Revolution of 1949. The next year, they published a new marriage law in China, which was a direct attack on the patriarchal and Confucian policies as they had been before. It decreed free choice in marriage, relatively easy divorce. They ended the practice of men having concubines. It was now illegal to do so. Child marriage was now forbidden. Permission for widows to remarry was enacted, and equal property rights for women was also legally enacted. And foot binding was, they went after foot binding, what remained of it in 1950, in a major way. I thought this was an interesting one. A free and independent marriage is good. There is great happiness in unified production. Not exactly romantic, you know. I don't know if unified production ever entered into your considerations about marriage life, but anyway, that was the communist justification for it. That if women were freed of these earlier restraints, they could be more active in producing for the revolution. Furthermore, Chinese women became much more actively involved in both agricultural and industrial production. By 1978, about half of the agricultural workers were women, and about 38% of the industrial workers were women. A famous slogan was "Women can do anything," or "Women hold up half of heaven." Now, for all of its achievements, there were limitations to this communist kind of feminism. As I mentioned, Stalin put an end to it because he thought that all of this upset about gender relations was inhibiting production, and what he was after in the 1930s was to catch up with the industrialized countries because they felt threatened by them. Furthermore, despite their achievements, the communist governments never really launched an attack on patriarchy in the home, which meant that as a result, that the so-called double burden of housework plus outside employment fell on women. In fact, when I was, I went to Russia pretty regularly for about 10 years. And what I heard from the few women feminists that I found there was that that situation had not changed. Women were still responsible for working in the factories or on the farms and for doing the bulk of the child care and housework. And of course, women appeared very seldom in the upper echelons of the communist political leadership in either country. So in the first half of the 20th century, the communist countries were sort of at the forefront of the women's liberation movement. In the second half of the century, however, particularly after 1960s, a new kind of feminism emerged in the West. It's often referred to as second wave feminism. And many people argue that it was initiated by this famous book, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Now, some participants in the second wave feminism took up the equal rights agenda of their 19th century foremothers, but with an emphasis now on employment and education rather than on the vote. This is an example of that. They want equal rights in pay and grading. And actually, this is the text of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first proposed in 1923. And is still not enacted in this country. More about that. Other strand of this second wave feminism, a more radical strain of it, which was widely known as women's liberation, took a broader aim at patriarchy, not just on particular issues, but they saw patriarchy as a systemic process of repression, similar to the kind of repression that was associated with class and racial issues. And this is an excerpt from the Women's Liberation Manifesto of 1969. And I think this was the main point. Because we live so intimately with our oppressors, we have been kept from seeing our personal suffering as a political condition. And the women's liberation movement, in various ways with which you are probably familiar, was a way of responding to those conditions. Another strand of the second wave feminism derived from women of color. For many African American women, the concerns of their white feminist sisters did not seem really relevant. Black women had always worked outside the home, and so they did not feel the need to be freed from the chains of homemaking, as Betty Friedan's followers were. Furthermore, white women might find the family oppressive, but for Black women, the family was a base of solidarity. They needed to be connected to their husbands and to their men in order to fight racism and poverty. And in these ways, they were different from the feminism of their white sisters. A third element in the 20th century is not only the communist expression of it and the second wave feminism in the West, but also feminism now in the second half of the 20th century became global. It became global in many parts of the world, and I simply wanted to illustrate a couple of those. In Kenya, a women's group movement got going. And in fact, by the time it really got in motion, there were some 27,000 small groups of women scattered all across the country of Kenya that provided personal support for each other. They also ran community projects like building water cisterns, small schools, small medical clinics. They also developed kind of a revolving loan association whereby women could purchase their own group. And one of the women wrote this: "I am a free woman. I bought this piece of land through my group. I can lie on it, work on it, keep goats or cows. What more do I want? My husband cannot sell it. It is mine." So this is one example of feminism taking shape in an East African country in this particular way. In Morocco, the focus of feminism came to revolve around the old law code of the country. And they mobilized. Actually, the King of Morocco was on their side, and by 2004, there was a new family law code that recognized women as equal to their husbands. It allowed them to initiate divorce and to claim child custody, all of which had previously been denied. In Chile, a women's movement emerged as part of the fight for democracy against the military dictatorship of General Pinochet. And that women's movement was a major part of the transition from China, from military rule to a democratic political system that took shape by 1990. Now, perhaps the most impressive achievement of the feminist movement in the 20th century was to proclaim it as a global issue, to win international recognition for the notion that women's rights are human rights. In this process, patriarchy had lost at least some of its legitimacy. It wasn't ended, but it certainly had been eroded. And this registered in 2006 when 183 nations ratified a United Nations Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. 186 nations. But not quite all. These are the nations that have not ratified this convention: Iran, Palau, Somalia, Sudan, Togo, and the United States. This is the company that we have kept on this issue. The Vatican also did not sign on to this. And as far as I know, we still have not ratified this convention. Now, once again, backlash. All of this global feminism obviously generated a backlash. Critics felt that feminism had undermined family life, the proper relationship of men and women, and civilization generally. Phyllis Schlafly thought that it was a disease that brought in its wake fear, sickness, pain, anger, hatred, danger, violence, and all manner of ugliness. In the Islamic world, Western-style feminism, with its claims of gender equality and open sexuality, was highly offensive to many. And feminism fueled these movements of Islamic fundamentalism and that found expression in the Iranian Revolution of 1969, which resulted, at least for a time, in women being required to wear the most extreme forms of covering themselves up. Now, I understand from friends who are Iranian and have been there recently that some of this has eased, in practice, if not in theory, but it is another interesting example of this kind of thing from Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East was the popularity of Barbie dolls. American Barbie dolls, Ken and Barbie, were very popular, apparently. But their relationship was not the kind of relationship that the Islamic regimes wanted to foster among their young men and women. And so they came up with alternatives. One of them was called Sarah and Dara. These were 8-year-old children who were devoted to their parents and listened to what they were taught. And these dolls have largely replaced Barbie and Ken in many Muslim countries. Many African governments and many African men define feminism of any kind as un-African and associated with colonialism. And of course, as the women's movement came to endorse lesbian and gay rights, this only solidified opposition to it. This is a picture from Uganda, where this minister from a church is condemning homosexuality, lesbians, and gay people. In fact, they have Uganda has made gay relationships apparently subject to the death penalty in Uganda. So, in conclusion, by the early 21st century, and in some parts of the world, patriarchy had been eroded, not necessarily ended, but eroded and challenged. The legal framework within which patriarchy had been embodied had been dented. Women have secured the vote, they have secured property rights, they have secured legal personhood. There are also equal pay laws, anti-discrimination laws, and reproductive freedom in many places. Cultural perceptions have also changed. Patriarchy, as I mentioned before, has lost some of its legitimacy, its moral standing, and has been subject to great challenges. There have been challenges to the traditional notion of women as homemakers and caregivers, the idea that gender is socially constructed rather than biologically rooted has gained a lot of attention. And there is, of course, a much greater awareness of violence against women, sexual consent, and so forth. And of course, there have been major social changes. There has been a massive entry of women in the most developed countries and in the communist countries into the modern workforce, along with considerable progress in literacy and higher education. But if patriarchy has been put on the defensive, it has also been persistent. Unequal earnings, underrepresentation in leadership positions, gender-based violence such as domestic abuse, sexual harassment, rape as a weapon of war, all of this has persisted. And of course, the unequal burden of care in the home is also remains for many people. And perhaps most significantly, the resurgence of a kind of authoritarian nationalism is often associated with the promotion of traditional gender relations. And the case in point here, of course, is the overturning of Roe versus Wade in this country. So as of 2025, patriarchy remains on the defensive, but also stubbornly persistent. Feminism has now been globalized. It is very diverse, and it is, of course, contested, both within the feminist movement and outside of it. So, enough from me. What do you have comments or questions, observations?
What's the situation in New Zealand now?
New Zealand is a socially advanced country. I mean, women have complete equality there now. I don't know what the state of the feminist movement is in New Zealand. You know, they had this wonderful woman prime minister for a time during the COVID era. I'm forgetting her name, Jacinda. She, I think, was an example of what women have achieved in New Zealand. Please.
So I have spent a lot of time wondering how patriarchy developed globally in ancient times. I don't necessarily think it was cross-pollination necessarily. I mean, there was some traveling, but why is it everywhere?
It's a big question among historians. It is basically associated with the development of civilization. And by civilization, historians refer to societies that are based in cities and around states, formal states. Now, what is it about civilization that generated patriarchy? There are a couple of possible answers to that. One is the plow. Previously, agriculture was done largely with a digging stick or a hoe, which meant that women could do it and without neglecting or forsaking their domestic responsibilities for childbearing and child raising. But with the development of the ox-drawn plow, some scholars have suggested that this made it more difficult for women to participate economically because it took greater strength to handle a plow.
With the baby on your back.
With a baby on your back, yes. And that the agriculture often took place at some distance from the home base. So some people blame the plow. There are other possibilities as well. One of them is large-scale warfare. I'm not suggesting that there was peace and tranquility in pre-agriculture, in pre-civilized societies, but there was not the kind of large-scale warfare that took place once civilizations and states came into existence. And warfare, of course, tends to privilege men. They're the ones that are involved in it. They take on the duty of protection of the country and its women. And so large-scale warfare. A third thing is commerce. With the development of civilization, market-based relationships took shape within and between civilizations. You know about the Silk Road trading networks and a number of these long-distance trading connections. Well, this highlighted private property. And women came to be seen as property that could be traded and negotiated back and forth. And so some people suggest that the emergence of market-based economies with private property and rights of ownership might have had something to do with it. The bottom line is that virtually all civilizations, there really aren't any major exceptions, as far as I can tell, practice this kind of ideologically based social system that relegated women as a natural event or a divinely inspired. This was God's will. You know, the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, of the Quran, of Hindu scriptures, inscribed patriarchy as part of the divine order or part of the natural way of being. But the
Just
debate
written
continues
by
on what exactly it was about civilizations. Now, I don't mean to suggest that gender relationships were perfectly equal and loving and tender before all of this took place. In fact, there are stories of Australian Aborigines. When the first Europeans arrived, they witnessed men beating the daylights out of women. So that I don't want to suggest that there was some gender equality of the kind that we are seeking here in pre-civilized societies. But it's pretty clear that the degree of gender inequality was much less ideologically inscribed and was much more relatively egalitarian. Partly because women were so essential to the economy of those societies, so they had some leverage. Sure.
Yes, is there any evidence that patriarchy was prevalent in society?
I don't think so. If you mean by matriarchal, sort of the female equivalent of
Yeah,
Of
like
patriarchal,
women running the show.
yeah, I don't think so. There were clearly matrilineal societies where descent was reckoned along the female line. But matriarchal, in terms of women being dominant and men being subordinate, I don't think so.
No, wondering about contemporary United States now, the financing of it is all the concentration of the wealth of corporations, it's men. And they are financing the campaigns, the elected officials, and they are putting their agenda, whichever human rights they have, their ideas in financing the elected officials.
Yeah.
Is that a form of a male domination of this concentrated wealth?
Well, it's not in the hands of women. I'm sorry, yes.
Well, there are a handful of women CEOs, I'm sure, but not very many. I think this kind of right-wing nationalism that we are seeing emerging here and in other parts of the world as well are generally associated with calls to return to some earlier form of family relationships and male-female relationships. So that I'm not sure exactly how that factors in with corporate domination of the economy.
Financing the elections,
Yes, yes,
that puts their agenda
yeah.
almost in play.
Although
And then you can
industries,
see from what is
Yeah.
a repression of,
yes. Although the Democrats have received a lot of funding from corporations as well as the
there's
Republicans.
just more of the men corporations, regardless of
Yeah.
the.
Yes.
Which country, or is there a couple of countries right now that where you would say if there's equality that's balanced, that's not like inflammatory as it is in the West? Are there any countries right now that would be our models, but or industrialized and developed or undeveloped?
The Scandinavian countries spring to mind, although they have big issues with immigration. And there are calls for return to a different kind of social order in many of these countries as well, even if they're not dominant. I think that New Zealand and Australia might be other places where you might look for that kind of thing. I remember when I lived in New Zealand for 6 months, at one point in 1998 was. And it was a lovely country. It was a small country. Nobody hated it. Except maybe the Australians when they played rugby. But it was a delightful place. I was tempted. And if I was 40 years younger, I might now be tempted to see if they had a place. But yeah, I guess I would look to the Scandinavian countries, to Australia, New Zealand.
You know, it's quite impressive, you've alluded to this, how the world's religions have been such a force for patriarchy uniformly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could comment on that. I mean, you would think religion could be a force for, we're all children of God and equality as well. And are there elements, like in Sufism, for instance, because Islam is known for being so patriarchal.
Yeah.
Are there elements of much more equality?
Well, most Sufi orders are run by men. In fact, we were in Turkey several times and visited some Sufi orders. There was one of them that was run by women, in which women did the turning. It was very beautiful, but that was the exception. And there were, in most of them, they were still gender segregated. And women were not welcome to be performing the turning dances, particularly in a public setting. So I don't know how much of a feminist consciousness has penetrated the Sufi world.
I know this isn't your area of expertise, but the psychology of patriarchy is always confusing.
Yes.
Like, so you're a man and you're better off than a woman. You've got more rights than a woman. In an early society, you've got a wife and you have kids with her. And assuming there's somewhere in there, you love something, you love your kids, you love your wife, you love somebody. And how do you, I mean, and women have equal brain power, we've always had it. So how does that actually work? Like on a daily basis?
Well, I have thought that about a number of things. I'm sorry?
I'm saying things, sorry. Or I just like that.
Go ahead.
No, I just said it works really well for them.
Yes, yes.
Sorry.
But I do wonder sometimes whether the answers to some of these questions lie in the realm of psychology or maybe even religion, rather than history. And the next one of these talks is about empire, and I want to raise that question too. Why do we keep doing this? What is it that makes us want to accumulate power? I hate to go back to, simplistic explanations about human nature, but maybe there's something to it. It may have something to do with opportunity. Yes.
Not just thinking, it's just occurring to me, the main difference between male and female is that the female gives birth.
Yes.
So wherever you are, that's a difference.
Yes.
It's just that, and maybe, inherently it's got its roots in that difference in physicality and whatever. you want to
Yes.
call it.
But the question is, why this kind of pervasive patriarchy emerged with civilizations? Why not before?
But you said a little while ago that the most gender equivalent societies were Scandinavian, and now that's being eroded by immigration.
Yeah.
So why is that? Why is immigration now a negative?
It's for the status quo
Well,
and it's
I'm not sure that it erodes women's rights in the Scandinavian countries, but it certainly empowers those who want to have more restrictive policies about immigration. But the two things often seem to go together. Now, I'm honestly not sure.
That's what I was Yeah.
if they do in the Scandinavian countries, have the calls for restrictions on immigrations in Sweden and Norway and Denmark, has that led to any attack on women's rights? I'm not aware that that has, but maybe other people have more. It certainly has here.
And maybe one thing leads to another.
I wonder,
Yes.
if you see feminism as something that challenges national identity, then perhaps if you want to go back to some earlier kind of national identity, and there have been all sorts of comments coming out of the
Which is
right.
today, right?
Yes,
Yeah, I think
yes,
that's what we hear.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Going down.
yes.
You suggested that the civilizational change of 5,000 years ago was a major contributor to this change.
Yes.
And so would it also probably include, or it's been suggested by someone that the development and use of the horse for warfare really accentuated
Yeah.
roles between
Yes,
males and
yes,
females, and therefore
yes.
contributed to warlike societies.
Yes, Yes,
And then along with that would be the development presumably of metallurgy. It takes a lot of metallurgy to build a plow.
yes, yes, yes. There were wooden plows before there were metal ones, but yes. And Mongol women rode horses and were active warriors as well, so it didn't entirely correspond.
When you speak about the white man has this position in a society, you know, a lot of that is conditioned onto him, you know. He brings the bacon home, that type of
Yes.
mentality. He carries the weight on with pulling the plow. He's responsible for feeding those people.
Yeah.
And if his demise comes by, his family loses out.
Yeah.
So he's calling the shots.
Yes, yes.
That's,
Well, this was Marx's explanation for gender inequality. It was because women did not have access to economic power. And he thought that when the revolution happened and women were equal economically, that then automatically this kind of patriarchy would dissolve. Well, it's getting on. It is 2:00. So, well, thank you for.
Oh, thank you. I heard the plan book. I just was wondering if you could tell us what your new book is.
I'm sorry, what?
I heard you have a new book coming out.
You have a new book?
No.
No, oh, I thought. you
Well,
were-
it's a new edition of my textbook,
A new, okay, new edition, that's
Yeah.
still a new edition.
but a lot of it is the same. Publishers have to do new editions to make people buy them. Many thanks indeed.
Is that all?